Generalization. It's a fun thing to do. Let's talk about it a bit. So this woman says Democrats love the democratic system and checks and balances when it works in their favor, not so much when it hurts their agenda. Sounds reasonable to me. This guy, however, seems to disagree. This is too much of a generalization and intellectually dishonest. It's unreasonable to paint all Democrats with the same brush. So I say a generalization paints a majority of a group, not all of the group. That's why the word all is the clarifier word. Because you see here it says it's unreasonable to paint all Democrats with the same brush. But no, that's the whole point of the word generalization. That's the whole point of the concept of generalization, is that you have to generalize most of the time. You use clarifier words when it's not a generalization or when people understand the thing to be always. So I'm going to run through some words here. Generalization, a general statement or concept obtained by inference from specific cases. So what does general mean? Considering or including the main features or elements of something and disregarding exceptions overall. So if I say an elephant is a large creature with a trunk, that doesn't mean that it doesn't also have big ears and the feet and the tail and all that other stuff. It just means that's the thing I'm focusing on. It's a main feature I'm talking about. It's a fair thing to say, in my opinion. So a trend, a general direction. Note the word general. And the reason why I bring up trend is because she's talking about a trend. Trends are not something where everything is something. It just means that a proportion is something. And when you say that it's a trend, you're saying that it's a thing that generally is a noticeable piece of the trend. Clarification, the act of making a statement or a situation less confused and more comprehensible. So that's why I say clarifier word. Because clarify is to make a statement less confused and more comprehensible. And I'm going to put a little more in there. It makes it more of a precise statement. Now, if people were always precise, we'd all be lawyers. It's just not possible. And so I'm bringing up default here because people talk about things in contexts, and you can assume a default context. So you can understand that the default context is pretty accurate, what she's saying. Because she's talking about a trend. She's talking about a generality. She's not talking about exceptions, because that would sort of defeat the point of pointing out a very large trend. Exceptions don't make the rule. The rule makes the rule. And a rule isn't absolute always. A rule will generally have exceptions. One of my favorite statements to say is, all rules have exceptions, even this one. Which means that most rules have exceptions, but sometimes rules do not have exceptions. But that is the exception to rules in general. So your context here, the circumstance that formed the setting for an event, statement, idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. So the default context is important to realize when reading something, when speaking about things. It is impossible to be 100% clear and also not overly wordy in every situation. Sometimes you must be very clear and precise. But when you're speaking, you're supposed to understand that other people can understand what you're saying by inferring things, and that you don't have to be ultra pedantic. And that's my next word here. Of or like a pedant. I find it very funny how they just point to that. So pedant is a person who is excessively concerned with minor details and rules, or with displaying academic learning. So in this case, the person's pointing out an exception to the woman's generality. But at the same time, he's not being detailed in his thinking, because he goes with generalization and saying all in the same data set, his same explanation. So it is important to understand that when people use a generality, that it is a generality, that it is a trend, and that saying not all doesn't really mean anything other than you're really paranoid about people thinking it means all. When most reasonable people, and I said most because I like to use clarifiers because people do this nonsense all the time about not understanding generalities, that most people do understand generalities, but some people do not. And some would be the clarifier here in terms of the trends of who do not understand generalities. So it is very amusing and both frustrating to see when people do this not all thing. Because of course not all. Unless somebody says all, then they're just talking about a trend. If you want to get specific and say it's not a general trend, and what you're speaking about as a generality is actually the exception, then okay. But words are important. Reason is important. And I just find this concept of generality and not all to be very entertaining and frustrating depending on the situation I'm in. But for this moment, it's rather entertaining. So hopefully everybody had a good time hearing me rant about the word all and generalization. I'm a bit of a pedant myself sometimes, but I do it mostly for entertainment.